Hi guys, tonight we begin a calm journey into the life of one of the most extraordinary women in history. Marie Curie was the scientist who dared to study what the human eye could not see, who discovered forces hidden inside matter itself, and whose quiet persistence reshaped the modern world. This story will take us from her humble beginnings in Poland to her groundbreaking discoveries in France, following the gentle yet determined steps of a woman who lit the invisible world. But before we begin, for those who enjoy slow, thoughtful stories about legendary figures, hit like, subscribe and share in the comments which personality or historical figure you'd like me to cover next. And tell me, where are you watching from? I'm always curious to see the different places my viewers are from. Marie Curie was born Maria Skłodowska in Warsaw in 1867, in a time when Poland did not exist as an independent nation. The land of her childhood was divided among powerful empires, and this shaped the way she saw life. Her country's identity was hidden, just as the forces she would later reveal were hidden inside atoms. Her father was a teacher of physics and mathematics, and her mother was also educated, though burdened by illness. The family valued learning deeply, even though their finances were modest. As a child, Maria showed a mind that was always searching. She read every book she could find, listened carefully to her father's lessons, and dreamed of possibilities far beyond the narrow streets of Warsaw. Yet her early years were also shadowed by loss. Her mother died when Maria was only 10, leaving a wound that never fully healed. The memory of her mother's strength and her absence gave Maria an unusual seriousness for her age. While other children might play lightly, Maria often turned inward, using books and study as both escape and comfort. Education was not simple for a girl in Russian-controlled Poland. Universities were closed to women, and intellectual freedom was limited. Still, Maria refused to let barriers define her. With her sister Bronisława, she formed a secret pact. One would work and support the other's studies abroad, and then they would exchange roles. It was a daring plan, born in whispers, carrying the weight of both hope and sacrifice. Maria worked as a governess for several years, teaching children in wealthy households. Though the work was tiring and sometimes lonely, she kept her mind alive with late-night study. She read about mathematics, physics, and chemistry, trying to keep pace with the expanding universe of scientific thought. She dreamed of Paris, of the Sorbonne, where great minds gathered and knowledge flowed more freely. Those years tested her patience. She fell in love once with the son of a family she worked for, but his parents refused the match because she had no wealth. It was a quiet heartbreak, another reminder of her position. Yet, instead of turning bitter, Maria turned stronger. She held on to her vision of study, of something larger than personal sorrow. When the time came, Maria kept her promise to her sister. She supported Bronisława's medical studies in Paris, and later, when her sister could finally help her in return, Maria gathered her courage and left Warsaw behind. She carried little with her except determination and an unshakable hunger for knowledge. The journey to Paris was not just a train ride. It was a passage from one life to another, from the shadows of limitation to the first glimpse of possibility. In Paris, Maria would become Marie, and the invisible world she had only imagined would begin to unfold before her. Arriving in Paris in 1891, Maria Skłodowska transformed into Marie. The city was unlike anything she had known, vast, restless, filled with energy and voices from every corner of Europe. She rented a small attic room, so cold in winter that ice formed on the walls, yet she barely noticed the discomfort, because her mind was absorbed in study. At the Sorbonne, Marie was surrounded by ideas that had only reached her through books back in Poland. She sat in crowded lecture halls where great professors spoke of physics, mathematics, and the mysteries of matter. She worked harder than most, often skipping meals to afford tuition and books. Thin and pale, she could be seen late into the night under the dim light of a lamp reviewing formulas until her eyes ached. Despite these hardships, Marie thrived. She completed her degree in physics in just 2 years, graduating at the top of her class, and soon after began studying mathematics. Her dedication drew quiet admiration. Though she remained shy and reserved, speaking softly with a distinct Polish accent, she did not chase attention, only knowledge. Paris in the 1890s was alive with scientific discovery. New theories about electricity, magnetism, and light were shaking the old certainties. Laboratories buzzed with experiments that seemed to edge closer to the secrets of nature. It was within this environment that Marie first encountered Pierre Curie, a man as quiet and thoughtful as she was. Pierre was already respected for his work on crystals and magnetism, but he lived simply, disliking fame and preferring the solitude of research. Their meeting was arranged by a colleague who knew Pierre needed help with his own projects. At first, Pierre admired Marie's precision and her tireless focus. She admired his calm intellect and his gentle spirit. Their bond grew not from grand gestures but from hours spent in the laboratory, side by side among instruments and notebooks. Marie, however, still faced doubts. She had come to Paris to learn, not to marry. Her sense of duty towards science was almost sacred, yet Pierre's sincerity touched her. He was not like others. He encouraged her ambitions, telling her she must pursue research not as a companion to him, but as an equal. In that promise she found a rare respect, one she had not known before. By 1895, Marie and Pierre married in a modest ceremony. There was no display of wealth. Marie even refused a traditional wedding gown, choosing instead a simple blue dress she could later use in the laboratory. For their honeymoon, they cycled through the French countryside, pedalling past fields and rivers, discussing the nature of the universe. It was a union of minds as much as hearts. Together they would step into a realm of discovery that neither could have imagined. In the years ahead, the Curies would open the door to an unseen world, one glowing faintly in the darkness, waiting to be revealed. Life as newlyweds for Marie and Pierre Curie was not filled with luxury but with purpose. They rented a small apartment near the school where Pierre taught, and most of their possessions were books, scientific instruments, and bicycles. Their happiness was rooted in simplicity. Pierre often described their shared life as a partnership of two people absorbed in their dreams. For Marie, it was the first time she felt fully supported in her intellectual ambitions. Unlike many men of the era, Pierre never saw her as less capable because she was a woman. Their evenings often ended not in salons or social gatherings, but in quiet discussions about physics, magnetism, or the latest scientific articles. In this harmony, Marie began her doctoral research. She searched for a subject that was both original and profound. Around this time, in 1896, news spread of a remarkable discovery by the French physicist Henri Becquerel. He had found that certain salts of uranium emitted mysterious rays that could pass through solid matter and fog photographic plates, even in darkness. It was an invisible force, unexplained and puzzling. Marie felt instantly drawn to this mystery. She believed that the phenomenon was not just a curiosity, but a doorway to something entirely new. Without hesitation, she chose to dedicate her thesis to the study of these strange rays. It was a bold decision. Few understood the significance of Becquerel's discovery, and the equipment available was limited. Yet Marie's patience and focus made her uniquely suited for the challenge. She began by carefully measuring the intensity of the rays emitted by different uranium compounds. Using a sensitive instrument called an electrometer developed by Pierre and his brother Jacques, she was able to track tiny electrical charges produced by the mysterious emissions. Her results were astonishing. She observed that the radiation did not depend on the chemical form of the uranium. It came directly from the atoms themselves. This was a revolutionary idea, suggesting that atoms were not indivisible, as long believed, but held hidden energies deep inside. Marie coined the term radioactivity to describe this phenomenon. It was the beginning of a new chapter in science, one that would change the world. Pierre soon joined her work, captivated by the possibilities. The small laboratory where they toiled was far from glamorous. It was a converted shed, with a leaky roof, uneven floors, and poor heating. The air was often filled with dust and the equipment was makeshift. Yet within this modest space, discoveries of immense importance were taking shape. Marie and Pierre laboured side by side. often handling heavy sacks of ore and stirring boiling cauldrons for hours. Their shared determination turned hardship into momentum. While others might have seen only discomfort, the Curies saw promise. They had chosen a path that was uncertain, but together they felt strong enough to pursue it. Step by step, they were moving closer to unveiling forces hidden within the very structure of matter. The discovery of radioactivity had opened a door, but Marie and Pierre knew that behind it still lay vast, unexplored territory. Their next challenge was to identify new substances that might carry this hidden energy. For this, they turned to pitchblende, a dark, heavy mineral from mines in Bohemia. It was known to contain uranium, yet its radioactivity was far stronger than uranium alone could explain. This hinted that something else, something undiscovered, was present. Obtaining pitchblende in sufficient quantities was not easy. The mineral was expensive and the Curies had little money, yet fortune favoured their persistence. The Austrian government, sympathetic to their research, allowed them to purchase tons of discarded ore at a reduced price. Soon their laboratory was filled with great piles of black rock, far more than most scientists would ever dare to handle. Processing the ore was gruelling. In their drafty shed, Marie and Pierre crushed the pitchblende into powder, mixed it with acids, and boiled it for hours in large iron cauldrons. The air was thick with chemical fumes, and their hands grew raw from labour. Marie later recalled these days with both hardship and affection. She wrote of stirring heavy mixtures for hours, her back aching, her clothes covered in dust, yet her mind alight with determination. Day after day they separated elements, tested their properties, and measured their invisible emissions with the electrometer. Their patience was extraordinary. At times, weeks of work produced only a faint trace of a new substance. Yet Marie never doubted that persistence would reveal the truth. And indeed, in 1898, their perseverance was rewarded. In July, they announced the discovery of a new element, which they named polonium, in honour of Marie's beloved homeland, still under foreign rule. It was both a scientific achievement and a patriotic gesture, a way of giving voice to a nation that could not speak for itself. Only months later, they identified another substance, even more powerful than polonium. They called it radium, derived from the Latin word for ray. Radium glowed faintly in the dark, a strange bluish light that seemed almost magical. It captured the imagination of scientists and the public alike. Newspapers began to speak of the Curies, though they themselves remained modest, rarely seeking attention. The glow of radium, however, was undeniable. It seemed to promise not only new understanding of matter, but also new possibilities for medicine and technology. For Marie, these discoveries were more than personal triumphs. They represented a step toward understanding the hidden structures of the universe. In naming polonium and radium, she was not only adding to the periodic table, but also proving that even in the most ordinary of substances lay extraordinary secrets, waiting patiently for those who had the courage to search. Though the world began to take notice in the small, dim shed where the Curies worked, life went on as before, quiet, steady, filled with the hum of effort. What mattered most was not fame, but the pursuit of truth, and that pursuit had only just begun. The glow of radium marked a turning point not only in science, but also in the lives of Marie and Pierre Curie. Their names began to spread beyond the quiet world of laboratories, whispered with admiration in universities and scientific circles. Yet fame meant little to them. They remained focused on the work, determined to isolate pure radium from the tons of pitchblende that filled their shed. This task was unlike anything they had faced before. Separating one element from another required endless repetition of crushing, dissolving, boiling, and precipitating. The quantities were so small that sometimes weeks of work produced less than a speck of substance. Still, Marie persisted with almost unshakable patience. She described those years as filled with both exhaustion and joy. Exhaustion, because her body grew weary from the heavy labour, her hands burned from contact with chemicals, and her health weakened in the damp, cold shed. Joy, because every faint glimmer of progress felt like proof that they were touching the unknown. Pierre shared this dedication, though he often worried about Marie's health. He too became consumed by the work, fascinated by the strange properties of radium. It seemed to release heat without burning fuel, a steady, invisible energy that defied ordinary explanation. Together, they began to realize that they were standing before forces that could transform the understanding of nature itself. Their discoveries brought invitations to speak, to publish, to travel. Marie, once a shy student, now stood before audiences explaining the mysteries of radioactivity. She spoke with quiet clarity, not seeking to impress but to illuminate. Listeners sensed her sincerity and were struck by her humility. Unlike many scientists who guarded their findings, Marie and Pierre shared their methods openly, believing that knowledge belonged to all humanity. In 1903, the Royal Swedish Academy of Sciences recognized their contributions by awarding the Nobel Prize in Physics to Marie, Pierre and Henri Becquerel. Marie became the first woman ever to receive such an honor. She accepted the award with dignity but without vanity. For her, it was not about personal recognition, but about the recognition of a field of study that was still new and fragile. The award brought them greater visibility, yet their daily life changed little. The laboratory remained the center of their world, the place where they felt most alive. They did not patent their discoveries or seek profit, even though radium would soon be valued highly. Instead, they chose to leave their work open for others to build upon. This decision reflected their belief in the universality of science, in the idea that discovery should serve not just individuals but all people. Still, the physical toll was undeniable. Both Marie and Pierre often suffered from fatigue, unexplained illnesses, and burns on their hands. At the time, no one fully understood the dangers of prolonged exposure to radiation. To them, the strange glow of radium was a wonder, not a warning. Their devotion was pure, their vision unclouded by fear. For now, their journey seemed filled with light, though shadows quietly gathered at its edges. The Nobel Prize brought Marie and Pierre Curie recognition, yet their personal lives remained modest, almost austere. Fame never distracted them from the work, which consumed nearly every hour of their days. Their laboratory was still the drafty shed behind the School of Physics and Chemistry, where piles of pitch-blende, glass flasks and rusted cauldrons filled the space. Visitors who expected grandeur often left surprised to find the world's most famous scientific couple surrounded by broken furniture and simple tools. Marie's sense of purpose remained unshaken. She divided her time between research, lectures, and her growing family. In 1897, she had given birth to their first daughter, Irene, and in 1904, their second, Ève, was born. Balancing motherhood with science was no easy task. She often rose before dawn to prepare lessons or analyze data, then tended to her children, only to return to the laboratory late into the night. Many around her were astonished at her endurance, but Marie rarely spoke of fatigue. Instead, she spoke of duty, both to her family and to her work. Pierre admired her strength, though he too struggled under the weight of their shared ambitions. He had been appointed to a professorship at the Sorbonne, which provided some financial stability, but his health was fragile. Long hours in the laboratory, exposure to chemicals, and lack of rest wore him down. At times he suffered sharp pains, dizziness, and weakness, though he continued to press forward. The Curie's discoveries also began to inspire broader interest beyond science. Physicians wondered if radium's mysterious rays could treat disease. Experiments suggested that tumours shrank when exposed to radiation. Marie watched with quiet hope as doctors began to test what would later become radiotherapy. For her, this possibility confirmed that science was not only about understanding, but also about healing. She believed deeply that knowledge should serve humanity. Despite this promise, practical obstacles remained. Producing even tiny amounts of pure radium was painstaking and costly. Still, Marie persisted, convinced that the effort would one day bear fruit. In 1906, however, her life changed suddenly and irreversibly. On a rainy April afternoon in Paris, Pierre was struck by a horse-drawn carriage and killed instantly. The shock was devastating. For years they had shared not only love but a vision of discovery, and now Marie found herself alone with 2 young children and the weight of unfinished work. Grief overwhelmed her, yet she did not collapse. Within weeks, she resolved to continue Pierre's lectures at the Sorbonne, becoming the first woman ever to hold a professorship there. Standing before students, still in mourning, she carried both her sorrow and her determination with quiet dignity. The world saw her as a widow, but she insisted on being recognized as a scientist. In the silence of her laboratory, she returned to the cauldrons and glassware, to the endless pursuit of radium. If anything, her resolve grew sharper. The invisible world she and Pierre had uncovered was still unfolding, and she would not let grief close the door they had opened together. The death of Pierre Curie left Marie in a state of quiet devastation, but also with a renewed determination to carry forward their shared vision. In 1906, only months after the accident, she stood before a lecture hall at the Sorbonne. The room was filled with students and colleagues who wondered whether this woman, dressed in black and still in mourning, could command the same respect Pierre had. When she began to speak, her voice steady though soft, those doubts faded. She explained complex principles with clarity and precision, her deep knowledge evident in every sentence. It marked a new chapter not only in her career but in the history of the Sorbonne. For the first time, a woman held a professorship at the prestigious institution. Taking Pierre's place was both an honour and a burden. She had lost her partner in life and science, but she refused to let sorrow silence her. Instead, she carried forward their research on radioactivity with even greater focus. Her laboratory became both sanctuary and battlefield, a place where memory and discovery intertwined. The demands on her were immense. She was a single mother raising 2 daughters, a professor responsible for teaching, and a scientist determined to push the boundaries of knowledge. Yet she managed all of it with a discipline that astonished those around her. Friends sometimes worried about her isolation, but Marie preferred the quiet rhythm of work to the distractions of social life. In 1911, her achievements brought her a second Nobel Prize, this time in chemistry, for the discovery of polonium and radium, and for her methods of isolating pure radium. She became the first person in history, man or woman, to receive 2 Nobel Prizes in different sciences. The recognition was historic, but once again Marie remained humble. Awards mattered less to her than progress in understanding the unseen forces of nature. Yet public attention was not always kind. Around the same time, her private life drew unwanted scrutiny. Rumours of a relationship with a fellow scientist, Paul Langevin, spread in the press, painting her unfairly as a scandalous figure. The newspapers were harsh, their words sharpened by prejudice against a foreign-born woman who had dared to succeed in a man's domain. The attacks wounded her deeply, but she endured them with quiet dignity. She did not respond with anger or defence, but with silence and continued work. Science remained her refuge. Even when controversy swirled, she returned to her laboratory, measuring, analysing and writing. For her, the invisible rays of radioactivity mattered more than the visible storms of public opinion. Through grief, through scandal, through prejudice, Marie's resolve never wavered. She stood as proof that brilliance need not shout to be heard. Her path forward was still filled with obstacles, but she carried within her a steady flame, a light strong enough to illuminate worlds hidden from ordinary sight. By the second decade of the 20th century, Marie Curie had become a symbol of both brilliance and resilience. She stood almost alone at the frontier of radioactivity, continuing the work she and Pierre had begun, while raising her daughters with care and discipline. Irene, the elder, was already showing signs of her mother's sharp intellect, while little Ève leaned more toward music and literature. Marie encouraged both paths, believing that true education was not only about knowledge, but about character and perseverance. The laboratory remained the centre of her life. She established the Radium Institute in Paris, a place devoted to research and medical applications of radioactivity. The building itself was modest, but its mission was vast, to unite physicists, chemists, and doctors in exploring how the strange rays of radium might serve humanity. Marie poured her energy into this vision, raising funds, directing experiments, and inspiring young researchers who looked to her as a guide. The possibilities seemed endless. Doctors were finding that radium could shrink tumours, offering hope against cancers that had long been untreatable. Patients travelled from across Europe to seek new treatments, sometimes with miraculous results. For Marie, this was proof that science was not only about discovery, but about healing. She saw in these early successes the seeds of a medical revolution. Yet the work was not without cost. She continued to handle radioactive materials with little protection, unaware of the long-term dangers. Glass vials of radium salts often glowed faintly in her desk drawers, and she carried small samples in her pockets to demonstrate their strange light. At the time, this glow was seen as wonder, not threat. No one yet understood how deeply it could affect the body. Her health suffered in subtle ways: fatigue, pain in her hands, a persistent weariness, but she pressed on, unwilling to let illness slow her progress. In 1914, as Europe slid into war, her work took on an urgent new dimension. When the German army advanced toward Paris, she refused to abandon the radium stored in her institute. Instead, she secured it in a bank vault in Bordeaux, determined that this precious substance would not fall into enemy hands. At the same time, she recognized a new need: battlefield medicine. X-rays, powered by the science of radiation, could locate bullets and shrapnel inside wounded soldiers, guiding surgeons and saving lives. Marie organized mobile radiology units, vehicles equipped with X-ray machines, that could travel directly to the front lines. She personally trained doctors and nurses in their use, teaching them how to operate the equipment under difficult conditions. These units came to be known as Petite Curie, or Little Curies, a name that carried both affection and respect. Marie herself often visited the front, working tirelessly in mud and chaos, far from the quiet of her laboratory. She exposed herself to danger without hesitation, believing it was her duty. Through war and hardship, she transformed her discoveries into tools of survival. In doing so, she proved once more that science was not separate from human life, but woven into its most urgent struggles. The First World War demanded sacrifices from millions, and Marie Curie gave her knowledge and strength without hesitation. The mobile radiology unit she developed became lifelines for soldiers on the battlefield. By 1916, she had personally trained over 100 women to operate X-ray machines, many of them inexperienced nurses who had never imagined themselves working with advanced technology. Marie insisted that they learn the principles of electricity, mechanics, and anatomy, believing that responsibility demanded understanding, not just obedience. Together with her teenage daughter Irene, she spent months at the front lines, where the thunder of artillery was constant and the smell of smoke clung to the air. Irene assisted with X-rays, standing beside her mother as they examined wounded soldiers, often under harsh and dangerous conditions. For both mother and daughter, these experiences were formative. For Marie, it reinforced her conviction that science was service. For Irene, it was the beginning of a path that would later lead her into nuclear research of her own. The soldiers called her simply Madame Curie, speaking of her with quiet gratitude. She asked for no honours, often refusing recognition for her wartime efforts. Yet her work saved countless lives, preventing amputations and guiding surgeons toward precision. Behind the lines, officials sometimes questioned whether a woman should take such a role, but Marie's results silenced doubts. She was practical, tireless, and unafraid of hardship. The war years drained her physically, but they also deepened her reputation as a figure of extraordinary courage. When peace returned in 1918, Marie's focus shifted back to research. The Radium Institute opened officially in 1919, its laboratories filled with young scientists eager to continue the exploration of radioactivity. Marie directed both the scientific and medical sections, dividing her time between fundamental physics and practical treatments for disease. Her vision was always twofold: to expand knowledge of the atom and to use that knowledge for the benefit of humanity. International recognition grew. Universities and institutions invited her to lecture, and she travelled widely, though always reluctantly. Public speaking was never her passion, but she understood its importance in raising funds for research. In 1921, she made a celebrated trip to the United States, where she was welcomed with admiration. Crowds gathered to see the woman who had revealed radium to the world. President Warren Harding presented her with a gram of pure radium, purchased through donations from American women who admired her achievements. For Marie, this gift was more than symbolic. It provided material essential for her continuing work at the Institute. Despite such honours, she never allowed herself to be carried away by fame. Her life remained anchored in simplicity, in long hours of study and careful experiment. Visitors often remarked on her modest office, its shelves lined not with trophies but with notebooks and instruments. She avoided luxury, wore plain clothing, and cared little for appearances. What mattered was the steady pursuit of truth. The war had shown her that science could save lives. Now, in the fragile peace, she dedicated herself to building a foundation for future generations to carry that work forward. Marie Curie's journey to the United States in 1921 was unlike anything she had experienced before. Accustomed to quiet laboratories and modest classrooms, she suddenly found herself the focus of parades, receptions, and speeches. Newspapers called her the most famous woman scientist in the world, and crowds gathered simply to catch a glimpse of her. Yet beneath the applause she remained shy, even uncomfortable. She accepted honours with grace, but her heart longed for the calm of her institute, where real work was done far from public spectacle. Still, she understood the necessity. The gram of radium presented to her by President Harding was more valuable than gold, and without it, many of her experiments could not continue. That gift represented the faith of thousands of women who had contributed to the campaign, and Marie carried it back to Paris as a treasure of science, not of vanity. Back at the Radium Institute, she resumed her mission of building a home for both research and medicine. The institute quickly became a centre of innovation, attracting young scientists from across Europe. Among them was her daughter Irene, now a brilliant student in her own right. Marie guided her patiently but firmly, demanding the same discipline from her as from anyone else. The work was rigorous, but mother and daughter found joy in discovery, their bond strengthened by shared purpose. The 1920s brought both triumph and strain. Marie's health, long weakened by years of exposure to radiation, began to show signs of decline. Her hands bore burns and scars, and fatigue often pressed heavily on her. Yet she refused to slow down. Each morning she climbed the steps to her laboratory, her determination stronger than her body's protests. She rarely spoke of pain, believing that attention belonged to science, not to personal suffering. International recognition continued to follow her. In 1922 she was appointed to the French Academy of Medicine, an honour no woman had held before. She travelled to conferences, met with statesmen, and inspired generations of young women who saw in her proof that barriers could be broken. And yet, she never let honours define her. She preferred evenings at home with her daughters, long walks in the countryside, or quiet hours writing in her notebooks. Visitors often noted her simplicity. She lived without extravagance, wearing the same plain dresses for years, caring nothing for fashion. To her, the greatest wealth was knowledge and the ability to share it. As the decade drew on, the scientific world advanced rapidly. The discoveries she had sparked were now leading others into the depth of atomic structure, laying the groundwork for an age she could only imagine. Marie watched with both pride and humility, aware that her role had been to open the door. What others would find beyond it remained a mystery, but she trusted that future generations would carry the light forward. By the mid-1920s, Marie Curie was no longer just a scientist. She had become a symbol of persistence and integrity. Her name was known on every continent, yet in her own mind she remained the same girl from Warsaw who once studied by candlelight. She disliked fame and tried to avoid public attention, but the world insisted on celebrating her. Universities sought her advice, foundations requested her presence, and newspapers followed her travels. Despite the admiration, she often felt lonely. Her work consumed her, and her health grew frailer with each year. The damage from long exposure to radiation could not be undone. Her eyesight weakened, her hands trembled at times, and exhaustion weighed on her body. Still, she pushed forward, convinced that science required sacrifice. She often said that one never notices what has been done. One can only see what remains to be done. That guiding thought kept her moving even when strength was fading. At the Radium Institute, her leadership inspired a new generation of researchers. Young men and women came from around the world to study under her guidance. She demanded precision, patience, and honesty, qualities she considered more important than brilliance. Mistakes were not condemned but corrected, while laziness found no tolerance. She treated her students with quiet respect, giving them space to grow, yet always reminding them of the moral duty of science, to serve humanity. Her daughters were central to her life. Irene, now a physicist, worked closely with her mother, continuing studies on radioactivity. Eve, though not drawn to science, became a gifted writer and musician, capturing her mother's life in words and melodies. Marie encouraged both equally, proud that each followed her own path. To her, success was not imitation but authenticity. In 1925, Marie returned briefly to Poland to attend the opening of a new Radium Institute in Warsaw, built with international support. It was an emotional journey, reconnecting her with the land of her birth. She spoke softly of her pride in bringing science to a country that had endured so much hardship. The trip reminded her of the distance she'd travelled, from a young governess in Warsaw to a global figure in Paris. And yet she felt the same quiet humility she always had. As she aged, her presence grew gentler, but her influence deeper. She wrote papers, guided experiments, and still dreamed of discoveries yet to come. Even as her health weakened, her mind remained sharp, her curiosity undimmed. She once told a colleague that she belonged not to the past but to the future. And indeed, though her own time was drawing shorter, she was building a foundation for generations who would inherit the world she had helped to reveal. The late 1920s brought both recognition and strain for Marie Curie. Her name was celebrated across the globe, and yet she remained a quiet, almost austere figure, more at ease with test tubes than with speeches. Invitations poured in from universities, governments, and international organizations. She accepted only those she felt essential, preferring to dedicate her energy to the Radium Institute. There, young researchers filled the halls, their experiments guided by her careful oversight. The atmosphere was demanding but inspiring, a place where science was pursued not for profit but for discovery. Marie insisted on this principle. She had always refused to patent her methods of isolating radium, believing knowledge should be free for all humanity. This decision cost her potential fortune, but it earned her respect as a figure of moral clarity. Visitors to the Institute often remarked on her presence. A small, serious woman in simple clothes, her hair already streaked with grey, moving quietly between workbenches, offering advice in a soft but steady voice. Despite her modesty, she carried an authority that few questioned. Her health, however, continued to suffer. Years of exposure to radioactive substances had left invisible scars. She often felt fatigued, and her eyesight grew increasingly fragile. Reading and writing for long hours caused pain, yet she would not abandon her work. Her notebooks, filled with precise data, became extensions of her willpower, records of experiments that demanded both patience and endurance. Irene, now a strong scientist in her own right, gradually took on more responsibility. Together with her husband, Frédéric Joliot, she would later continue her mother's legacy, but at this time she was still learning under Marie's steady hand. Ève, meanwhile, became her mother's companion in another way, writing, playing music, and providing moments of lightness in a life otherwise filled with heavy responsibility. By 1929, Marie once again crossed the Atlantic. The American press greeted her warmly, seeing in her both a heroine of science and a symbol of perseverance. This second trip was aimed at raising funds for the Radium Institute in Warsaw, a project close to her heart. President Herbert Hoover received her, and American women once again contributed to the cause. The trip left her exhausted, but it also reaffirmed her belief that science could unite people across nations. Returning to Paris, she resumed her quiet routine, balancing teaching, research, and writing. To those around her, she seemed fragile, yet her spirit remained unyielding. She knew her strength was fading, but she refused to retreat from her calling. Each experiment, each lecture, each line written in her notebooks carried the same purpose as in her youth: to seek truth in the invisible. As the 1930s began, Marie Curie was entering the final decade of her life, though she did not yet know it. Her work remained constant, her dedication unshaken, but her body was showing clearer signs of strain. She often felt weak and tired, sometimes unable to finish a day's tasks without resting. Yet she never complained openly. To her students, she appeared as determined as ever, moving slowly but steadily through the laboratories of the Radium Institute, always ready to advise, correct, or encourage. She kept her private discomfort hidden, unwilling to let it overshadow the pursuit of knowledge. Despite her condition, her influence only grew. The discoveries she had set in motion were transforming science. Radioactivity was no longer a mysterious curiosity. It had become a central field of research, linked to medicine, chemistry, and physics alike. Scientists around the world built on her findings, pushing toward a deeper understanding of atomic structure. Though she never sought recognition, Marie quietly took satisfaction in seeing how far the field had come since her early days in the shed with Pierre. Her daughters were now adults, each carrying forward her legacy in different ways. Irene and her husband Frédéric worked at the Radium Institute, where they conducted experiments that hinted at even greater discoveries to come. Ève, more distant from the scientific world, had begun writing about her mother, capturing in words the humanity behind the legend. Marie valued both paths equally, proud that her daughters had found ways to express their gifts. In 1931, Marie travelled once more to the United States, this time to attend the International Conference on Radiation. She was received with the same admiration as before, though her frailty was now more visible. Observers noted her pale complexion, her slow movements, and her difficulty with vision. Yet when she spoke, her voice retained its clarity and conviction. She described the progress of radioactivity research with calm authority, inspiring younger scientists who regarded her as the founder of their field. Back in Paris, she continued to write and to guide her students. She published textbooks that distilled decades of research into clear explanations, ensuring that knowledge could pass to the next generation. Even as her strength waned, her mind remained sharp and her curiosity alive. She often reminded her colleagues that discovery was never finished, that each answer led only to new questions. Her words carried weight not because they were dramatic, but because they came from a life of unbroken dedication. As the decade advanced, those closest to her could see her health declining, but Marie herself remained focused on her purpose. To her, the invisible world still held mysteries worth seeking, no matter how short the time left to pursue them. The early 1930s were years of both recognition and decline for Marie Curie. Her achievements had placed her among the greatest scientists in history, yet her body, worn down by decades of exposure to radiation, continued to weaken. Her eyesight grew poor, forcing her to rely on assistants for reading detailed measurements, and her hands trembled when holding instruments. Still, she persisted in her daily routine at the Radium Institute. Students often saw her arrive early, wrapped in a simple coat, moving quietly through the halls to check on experiments. Her presence alone carried authority. Though frail in body, she remained a pillar of discipline and determination. International honours continued to come. She was invited to conferences, awarded medals, and celebrated as a pioneer. Yet Marie never allowed such recognition to distract her. She avoided banquets, disliked ceremony, and preferred to speak of science rather than of herself. To those who admired her most, her humility was as inspiring as her discoveries. She still believed that knowledge belonged to all humanity, not to individuals. In her final years, she became increasingly focused on ensuring the Radium Institute would thrive after her. She mentored young scientists, teaching them not only techniques but also the values of honesty, perseverance and service. Among these young researchers, her daughter Irene and son-in-law Frederick were emerging as leaders, carrying forward the study of radioactivity. Watching them gave Marie quiet satisfaction. She had no desire for monuments or statues. Her true legacy, she felt, would be the work of those who came after. Meanwhile, Eve remained by her side in another way, offering companionship and recording her mother's story with care. Eve's writings would later reveal the tenderness and humanity behind the stern figure the public saw. For Marie, the presence of both daughters provided comfort in the face of growing frailty. By 1933, her health had become too fragile for long journeys, but she still attended occasional scientific meetings. Colleagues often remarked that when she entered a room, conversation hushed, not because of grandeur, but because of the quiet force of her presence. She spoke sparingly, yet every word carried the weight of lived conviction. Those who met her in those years rarely forgot her. Her life seemed to embody the very spirit of science: curiosity without vanity, progress without greed, service without self. Even as her body failed, her mind remained devoted to the invisible rays that had defined her life. She sensed that her own chapter was nearing its close, yet she carried on with the same calm determination she'd shown since her youth. To her, the search for truth was endless, and she would walk its path as long as she could take a step. By 1934, Marie Curie's health was failing rapidly. Decades of close contact with radioactive materials had left their silent mark. She often suffered from weakness, dizziness, and severe anemia. Doctors struggled to identify the cause, for at that time the long-term dangers of radiation were still not fully understood. Marie herself never blamed her work. She accepted illness as part of the price for discovery, refusing pity and focusing instead on the task still before her. In June of that year, she travelled to a sanatorium in the French Alps, hoping the mountain air would restore her strength. The journey was difficult. She moved slowly, her body fragile, yet her spirit remained composed. Surrounded by the calm of the mountains, she continued to speak with Eve about her life, her daughters, and the future of science. On July 4th, 1934, Marie Curie passed away at the age of 66. The official cause was aplastic anemia, a condition brought on by prolonged radiation exposure. Her death marked the end of an extraordinary life, yet her influence was far from finished. News of her passing spread across the world. Newspapers mourned not only a great scientist, but a symbol of perseverance and integrity. Tributes poured in from universities, governments, and fellow researchers. Many emphasized that she had changed not only science, but also society, proving that women could achieve greatness in fields once closed to them. Her funeral was simple, as she had wished. She was laid to rest beside Pierre-en-Sault, the quiet suburb where their shared journey had begun. Colleagues and students stood in silence, honouring not grandeur but devotion. Years later, her remains, together with Pierre's, would be moved to the Pantheon in Paris, a place reserved for France's most distinguished figures. There she lies today, the first woman honoured for her own achievements, her name inscribed among the nation's immortals. Yet Marie's legacy is not confined to monuments. Her daughters carried her torch forward. Irene, with her husband Frederick, would go on to win the Nobel Prize in Chemistry for their discovery of artificial radioactivity, continuing the family's extraordinary contribution to science. Eve preserved her mother's story in a biography that revealed both the brilliance and the humanity of the woman behind the legend. Beyond family, Marie's influence shaped generations of scientists and physicians. Her discoveries gave rise to new branches of physics and to treatments that saved countless lives. More than that, her example taught the world that knowledge must be pursued with humility, dedication, and courage. Though her life ended quietly, the light she had kindled in the invisible world continued to shine, guiding humanity into an age where the atom itself would be unlocked. Marie Curie's passing in 1934 closed one chapter but opened another. Her work did not end with her death. It continued to grow through the lives she had touched, the students she had trained, and the discoveries her research had made possible. At the Radium Institute in Paris, her daughter Irene and son-in-law Frédéric Joliot carried forward her mission. They expanded on the foundation she had laid, working with the same precision and persistence that had defined her own career. In 1935, their efforts were rewarded when they announced the discovery of artificial radioactivity, a breakthrough that earned them the Nobel Prize in Chemistry. This achievement confirmed what Marie had always believed, that knowledge must be passed on, carried forward, and shared across generations. The Radium Institute itself became a living monument to her vision. Researchers from around the world came to study within its walls, attracted not only by the resources but by the legacy of the woman who had built it. They spoke often of her discipline, her humility, and the moral clarity she had brought to science. Even in absence, her influence remained a guiding force, reminding them that discovery was not an end but a responsibility. Eve Curie, meanwhile, took another path. In 1937, she published her biography, Madame Curie, a work that revealed the private strength and sacrifices behind the public figure. The book was widely read, translated into many languages, and introduced new generations to the story of a woman who had pursued truth against all odds. Eve also travelled as a journalist, bringing her mother's example of courage into the world of letters and diplomacy. Together, the daughters reflected different sides of Marie's legacy, one scientific, the other humanistic, both honouring the mother who had shaped their lives. Beyond family, the influence of Marie Curie spread into medicine and technology. Hospitals began to establish radiology departments, using X-rays and radium treatments that traced directly back to her research. For patients, her work meant hope. For doctors, it meant new tools. For scientists, it meant fresh questions. She had opened a door that could never again be closed. Even in politics and education, her impact was felt. Women who sought careers in science pointed to Marie Curie as proof that barriers could be overcome. Universities gradually began to admit more women, inspired by her achievements. Her life became a story of possibility, reminding the world that talent knows no boundaries of gender or nationality. Though she had left the world physically, the invisible light she had revealed continued to guide it. Her name became synonymous with perseverance, integrity, and the pursuit of truth. In this way, her presence endured, quiet yet indelible, shaping the course of science long after her voice had grown silent. In the years following Marie Curie's death, the world she had helped shape entered a new era. The discoveries she and Pierre began had grown into a vast field, now influencing medicine, chemistry, and physics in ways few could have imagined in the 1890s. At the Radium Institute in Paris, Irene and Frédéric Joliot-Curie worked tirelessly, their experiments leading to the creation of artificial radioisotopes. These new substances promised breakthroughs not only in scientific understanding, but also in practical applications, from diagnosing disease to studying the structures of living organisms. Their Nobel Prize in 1935 was celebrated not only as their triumph, but as a continuation of Marie's legacy. Across Europe, scientists and doctors invoked her name when speaking of progress in radiology. Hospitals expanded their use of radiation therapy, and patients who once had no hope began to see new chances for survival. The quiet work done in a drafty shed years earlier now echoed in the lives of thousands. At the same time, Marie Curie's image as a cultural figure deepened. Her biography by Eve circulated widely, offering readers a glimpse of the determination, simplicity, and humanity behind the discoveries. For many young women, it was not the equations or experiments that inspired them most, but the portrait of a woman who had persevered in the face of poverty, prejudice, and personal loss. In classrooms from Paris to New York, her story was told not only as science, but as history, a reminder of what dedication could achieve. Yet the scientific world was changing rapidly, and some of the forces unleashed by her discoveries carried darker implications. As researchers probed deeper into the atom, the potential for destructive power began to surface. Though Marie had always insisted that science must serve humanity, the 1930s and 1940s revealed a more complicated reality. Still, those who remembered her spoke of her moral clarity, of her belief that knowledge should never be hoarded or twisted for harm. Her influence served as a compass, reminding later generations of the values she had embodied. Even as nations prepared for war, students at the Radium Institute recalled her soft voice, urging honesty and perseverance above all. The physical traces of her life remained too. Her notebooks, her laboratory equipment, even her modest office carried the faint radiation of the materials she'd worked with. Locked away for safety, they became silent witnesses to the risks she had unknowingly endured. To those who studied her legacy, this fact was haunting, yet it also testified to her extraordinary courage. She had faced the invisible with open hands, never turning away from the unknown. Her life, though ended, continued to illuminate the path ahead. As the 1930s gave way to the 1940s, the legacy of Marie Curie became even more intertwined with the course of world events. The science of radioactivity, once confined to a handful of laboratories, was now shaping the future of medicine, physics, and even geopolitics. Her students and successors carried forward her vision, though often in directions she herself had not foreseen. At the Radium Institute, Irene and Frédéric Joliot-Curie continued to expand their work, publishing groundbreaking research on nuclear reactions. Their discoveries suggested that atoms could be split, releasing enormous amounts of energy. While for them the focus was scientific progress and potential applications for peace, others soon recognized the military possibilities. The shadow of war was rising across Europe, and nuclear science would eventually become a part of that struggle. Yet Marie's own voice, preserved in her writings and remembered by her colleagues, stood as a reminder that science should remain a tool for healing, not destruction. Her institute, meanwhile, remained a hub of medical progress. Doctors there refined techniques of radiotherapy, treating cancers with increasing precision. Patients spoke of the hope that the Curie method gave them, and hospitals across the world began adopting similar approaches. Marie's name became almost synonymous with care. Her discoveries transformed into acts of compassion. Eve Curie, far from the laboratory, also carried her mother's torch in her own way. As war spread, she became a journalist and later joined humanitarian missions, writing about conflict and resilience. Her book about her mother continued to inspire readers, offering comfort and courage in a time of uncertainty. Wherever she travelled, people recognized the name Curie and associated it with perseverance, service, and truth. Meanwhile, Marie's scientific contributions continued to ripple outward. In America, her story was taught as an example of determination and genius, inspiring new generations of students. In Poland, her homeland, she was remembered as a symbol of national pride, proof that even under oppression, greatness could emerge. In France, she remained a figure of honour, her institute standing as both a monument and a living centre of progress. Yet the irony of her life was clear. The very rays she had revealed to the world were now being studied not only for medicine, but for weapons of unprecedented power. Those who had known her often recalled her humility, her refusal to profit from discoveries, and her insistence that science must serve humanity. As global events moved in darker directions, her example provided a contrast, a vision of knowledge pursued with purity, sacrifice, and hope. Even in absence, Marie Curie's presence was felt, her light continuing to shine in an age struggling to balance discovery with responsibility. The Second World War cast a heavy shadow over the legacy of Marie Curie, though she had passed away years earlier. Her discoveries lived on in every X-ray machine used to treat wounded soldiers, in every hospital where radium provided hope for the sick, and in every laboratory where scientists probed deeper into the secrets of the atom. The Radium Institute in Paris, her great creation, became a place of both risk and resilience during the conflict. Occupied by German forces, it continued to function under great difficulty. Scientists worked cautiously, guarding both their research and their integrity, aware that knowledge could be twisted for destructive ends. Many remembered Marie's quiet insistence that science belonged to humanity, not to nations, and they tried to honour her principles in a world torn apart by war. Irene and Frédéric Joliot-Curie, deeply influenced by Marie's example, found themselves drawn not only into research but also into resistance. They supported movements that sought to defend freedom and protect the values their mother had embodied. For them, science and morality were inseparable, and the fight for truth extended beyond the laboratory. Eve Curie also took part in the struggle, travelling widely as a correspondent and later serving with humanitarian organisations. Her work during the war showed another side of her mother's influence, the conviction that service to others was the highest calling. Everywhere she went, people still spoke Marie's name with respect, remembering her as a woman who had given her life to the pursuit of light in the invisible world. Beyond Europe, her legacy flourished in medicine. In the United States, clinics and hospitals expanded their use of radiotherapy, building directly on the techniques pioneered by the Curies. Patients facing cancer found new hope in treatments derived from her discoveries, and doctors spoke of her with gratitude even as they never met her. For many, her story became proof that science could heal as well as explain. Yet at the same time, the darker potential of nuclear research grew clearer. Scientists working in secret projects were aware that the path to atomic weapons had begun with the study of radioactivity. Some found comfort in recalling Marie's belief in openness, her refusal to patent discoveries, her desire that science remain a gift to all. They wondered what she would have thought of their work. Perhaps she would have reminded them that discovery itself is neutral, and that responsibility lies with those who choose how to use it. In this way, her memory served as both inspiration and conscience, during a time when the world struggled with the consequences of the very forces she had unveiled. Though absent, Marie Curie remained present, this silent guide whose life embodied both the promise and the peril of knowledge. When the war finally ended in 1945, the world emerged into a new age, one deeply shaped by the discoveries Marie Curie had set in motion. Atomic science stood at the centre of attention, its power demonstrated in both medicine and warfare. To many, this duality reflected the contrast between Curie's vision of science as a force for healing and the reality of its destructive potential. Yet even in this complicated moment, her legacy remained a source of guidance. The Radium Institute in Paris, scarred by years of occupation, resumed its mission with renewed energy. Irene and Frédéric Joliot-Curie returned to their work, focusing on peaceful uses of nuclear science. They believed deeply in continuing Marie's principles, that knowledge should be shared, that progress must serve humanity, and that science without ethics was incomplete. Their leadership inspired young scientists who entered laboratories carrying not only curiosity, but also a sense of responsibility. Across the world, Marie's story gained new significance. In classrooms, teachers told students about the woman who had won 2 Nobel Prizes, who had laboured in a drafty shed to uncover radium, who had defied barriers of gender and nationality. To young women especially, she became a symbol that brilliance and perseverance could open doors once thought permanently closed. Her biography, written by Ave, spread into more languages, ensuring that her life was remembered not just in scientific circles, but in homes and libraries across continents. In Poland, her homeland, she became a figure of national pride. Streets and schools bore her name, statues were raised in her honour, and children learned of her as proof that greatness could arise from humble beginnings, even in a country that had once been denied independence. In France, she was celebrated as a pioneer who had given the nation one of its most treasured scientific institutions. In America, she remained a beloved figure. Her trips across the Atlantic remembered as moments of unity between nations. The practical impact of her discoveries also deepened. Radiotherapy became a standard treatment in hospitals worldwide, extending lives and offering relief to those once beyond hope. Each patient treated carried, in some small way, the mark of her work. Doctors often reflected on how her pursuit of invisible rays had become a tool of compassion. Even as new atomic research moved toward power reactors and advanced physics, the medical uses of radiation continued to embody her original vision. At the same time, her personal story of poverty, perseverance, and humility remained timeless. She had never sought wealth or fame, only truth. Her life, though filled with hardship, showed that knowledge pursued with sincerity could light the world. In the uncertain years after the war, her example stood as a reminder that science could be a path not of destruction, but of healing, service, and hope. In the years following the Second World War, the figure of Marie Curie took on an almost legendary quality. To scientists, she remained the pioneer who had first named radioactivity and brought radium into the light. To the public, she was remembered as the quiet woman who had worked tirelessly in a shabby shed, driven not by wealth or ambition, but by a desire to uncover truth. Her legacy became both scientific and symbolic, a story told to inspire not only researchers but anyone facing obstacles. The Radium Institute, now renamed the Curie Institute, flourished in the post-war years. It became a centre not only for advanced research but also for cancer treatment, fulfilling Marie's hope that science should serve humanity directly. Patients came from across the world, and the methods developed there were applied in hospitals on every continent. Each success was a reminder of her vision, that discovery could be transformed into healing. Irene and Frédéric Joliot-Curie continued her work, though their careers unfolded against the backdrop of the Cold War. They championed the peaceful use of atomic energy, arguing that knowledge should be directed toward progress rather than destruction. Their voices echoed the principles Marie had lived by, even as the world wrestled with the consequences of nuclear weapons. Their dedication, like hers, was not only to discovery, but to the moral responsibilities of science. At the same time, Marie Curie's story became part of education worldwide. Textbooks presented her as the first woman to win a Nobel Prize, and the only person to win in 2 different scientific fields. Teachers told of her long nights of study in Paris, of her sacrifices, and of her unshakable humility. For many young women entering classrooms in the 1950s and 1960s, she stood as a pathbreaker, proof that barriers could be overcome. In Poland, her memory carried special weight. As the country rebuilt itself after devastation, she was celebrated as a symbol of resilience and national pride. Institutions bore her name, statues were erected, and her image appeared in schools and on stamps. To the Polish people, she was not only a scientist but a daughter of their nation who had given something enduring to the world. Beyond national borders, her influence spread into culture. Writers, filmmakers, and artists drew inspiration from her life, presenting her as a model of integrity. Even as society debated the promises and dangers of atomic science, Marie Curie was remembered as someone who had faced the unknown with courage and without greed. Her life continued to stand as a reminder that discovery, pursued with humility and responsibility, could bring light even in times of uncertainty. By the mid-20th century, Marie Curie's name had become inseparable from the very idea of science itself. In universities, her discoveries were taught as foundational, while in homes her life story inspired children to imagine futures once thought impossible. She was not only remembered for radium and polonium, but also for the example of perseverance she had set. An image of a woman who had crossed boundaries of class, gender and nationality in pursuit of truth. The Curie Institute in Paris grew steadily after the war, attracting scientists from around the globe. Researchers came to study cancer treatments, nuclear chemistry, and the behaviour of isotopes, building directly on the foundation Marie had laid. Patients entered its doors with hope, and many left with renewed strength. The Institute stood as both a hospital and a laboratory, a place where her vision of science in service to humanity came alive each day. Irene and Frederick Joliot-Curie, leading figures at the Institute, also became public voices for peace. They spoke out against the use of nuclear energy for weapons, urging nations to remember the responsibility that came with discovery. In their appeals, listeners could hear the echo of Marie's principles, that science was never to be hoarded or twisted for harm, but to be shared for the common good. Her influence was visible in the lives of her daughters in different ways. Eve Curie, far from the laboratory, worked as a journalist, author and humanitarian, later serving with the United Nations. She often spoke of her mother's quiet strength, describing her not only as a scientist, but as a woman of simplicity and kindness. Through Eve's words, readers around the world glimpsed the humanity behind the legend, the mother who cooked simple meals, who refused vanity, who walked to her laboratory with a clear purpose each morning. In Poland, the image of Marie Curie took on deep cultural significance. Schools, streets and institutions were named after her. She was celebrated as proof that brilliance could arise even from hardship, that a nation deprived of independence could still give something lasting to humanity. Children learned her story alongside lessons of history and literature, seeing in her a figure of both science and patriotism. In France, her burial in the Pantheon in 1995, decades after her death, confirmed her place among the nation's most honoured figures. It was a recognition of her contributions not just to France but to the world. To walk past her tomb was to remember that true greatness does not seek fame, but serves truth with quiet devotion. By then, her notebooks and equipment, still radioactive, were kept sealed for safety. Scholars who studied them wore protective clothing, a strange reminder of how intimately she had lived with the forces she uncovered. The danger they carried testified to her courage, but also to the innocence of her time, when the risks of radiation were unknown. Even so, her legacy remained untarnished. The glow of radium that once lit her path had become, for humanity, a light of knowledge, guiding future generations in science, medicine, and the pursuit of truth. As the 20th century advanced, the legacy of Marie Curie grew ever more profound. In laboratories, hospitals, and classrooms, her name was spoken with respect, not only for what she had discovered, but for how she had lived. She had shown that science could be pursued with integrity, humility, and courage, even when the world around her doubted her worth. To young women entering fields once closed to them, she remained a beacon, her story passed down as proof that barriers could be broken by perseverance. The Curie Institute in Paris expanded its influence, becoming a model for research centres worldwide. It was a place where fundamental studies of atomic structure were carried out alongside medical treatments for patients. Each day, scientists in white coats worked in rooms filled with the quiet hum of machines, while nearby doctors applied radiation therapies that saved lives. This dual mission, discovery and healing, was the embodiment of Marie's vision. In Warsaw, the Radium Institute she had helped establish also flourished. Despite the hardships of war and reconstruction, it stood as a symbol of national pride, connecting her homeland to the wider scientific world. For Polish students, Walking through its halls meant walking in the footsteps of someone who had carried their nation's name into history. Beyond institutions, her influence shaped culture. Films and books portrayed her as a pioneer who had illuminated the invisible, often emphasizing her struggles as much as her triumphs. These stories captured the imagination of audiences who saw in her not only a scientist but a human being who had endured poverty, loss and prejudice, yet never abandoned her calling. Such portrayals made her accessible, turning her into an enduring figure of inspiration far beyond the world of science. The mid-century also brought reflections on the risks she had unknowingly borne. Historians and scientists acknowledged that her long exposure to radiation had led to her illness, and they spoke of her sacrifice with reverence. Her notebooks and laboratory tools, preserved but still dangerously radioactive, became artifacts of both discovery and warning. To handle them, researchers wore protective gloves, a striking contrast to the unguarded hands with which she had once worked. This paradox deepened the sense of awe surrounding her life. She had embraced the unknown so completely that it had marked her body, even as it illuminated the world. Yet her story was never one of tragedy alone. It was one of perseverance, vision, and service. Generations after her passing, her name continued to guide discussions on ethics in science, on the balance between discovery and responsibility. Wherever humanity reached toward the unseen, whether in physics, medicine, or beyond, Marie Curie's spirit seemed present, reminding the world that true greatness lies not in power, but in the quiet pursuit of truth. By the latter half of the 20th century, Marie Curie's name had become woven into the very fabric of modern science. Her discoveries were no longer recent history, but the foundation upon which whole disciplines rested. Every physics textbook spoke of radioactivity. Every hospital with a radiology wing bore indirect testimony to her work, and every young scientist who pursued truth against difficulty could find encouragement in her story. She had become more than a figure of the past. She was a symbol of what science could mean at its best. The Curie Institute in Paris entered a new era of expansion. Laboratories filled with new technologies explored nuclear physics and medical treatments with a precision unimaginable in Marie's time. Yet her presence was still felt in the culture of the Institute. Students were reminded of her insistence on discipline and honesty, her belief that discovery should never be pursued for personal glory but for the advancement of humanity. Her portrait hung in the halls, not as decoration but as a quiet reminder of the standards she had set. In Warsaw, the Radium Institute also carried forward her mission, even through political and social upheaval. Polish scientists and physicians regarded it not only as a research centre, but as a national treasure, proof that their country had given the world something enduring. The connection between Paris and Warsaw, established through Marie's vision, continued as a bridge across borders. Her influence spread into culture in new ways. Schools across Europe and America told her story to young girls as encouragement that intellectual dreams were not limited by gender. She was held up beside other pioneers, but her example was unique. She had not sought fame, wealth, or recognition, yet she had received all three because of her devotion to truth. Writers emphasized her humility, her plain dresses, her modest meals, her quiet manner, as much as her brilliance, making her seem at once extraordinary and accessible. At the same time, historians began to reflect on the paradox of her life, that the very forces she had uncovered had harmed her health. They spoke of her sacrifice not as a tragedy, but as a measure of her courage. The radioactive notebooks she left behind, still dangerous to touch, became symbols of both the risks and the triumphs of discovery. They were reminders that curiosity often requires stepping into the unknown, and that such steps can reshape the world. By the 1960s and 1970s, her image had become timeless. In a century marked by rapid change, she remained a steady point of inspiration. A woman who had lit the invisible world and shown that even in hardship, knowledge could be pursued with dignity and purpose. As decades passed, Marie Curie's presence in science seemed only to grow stronger. By the late 20th century, her name was no longer just that of a great scientist, but a symbol of integrity, perseverance, and possibility. Generations of researchers, many of whom had never known a world without her discoveries, spoke of her as though she were still a guiding colleague. Her story was retold in classrooms, not only as history, but as a lesson in determination. How a young woman from Warsaw, facing poverty and prejudice, had gone on to alter the understanding of matter itself. The institution she founded flourished. The Curie Institute in Paris became one of the most respected centres for medical research, especially in oncology. Patients walked its halls every day, receiving treatments made possible by the discoveries Marie had begun in a modest shed decades earlier. Doctors there often invoked her memory, aware that without her their fight against disease would look very different. In Warsaw, the Radium Institute likewise endured, a monument to both national pride and international science. Students who studied there felt a connection not only to modern research, but also to a woman who had carried Poland's name into the wider world. Beyond laboratories, her life inspired artists, writers, and filmmakers. Plays and films depicted her struggles and triumphs, capturing the drama of her work and the quiet dignity of her character. These stories reached audiences far beyond the scientific community, turning her into a cultural figure whose appeal crossed boundaries of age, gender, and profession. Teachers told her story to children not to explain radioactivity, but to show what persistence and honesty could achieve. Yet her influence was not only inspirational, it was also practical. By the 1980s, radiation therapy had become a standard treatment for many cancers, saving or prolonging countless lives. Each success carried a trace of her vision, her belief that science must serve humanity. Even when new technologies replaced radium with more advanced tools, her pioneering role was remembered with gratitude. At the same time, her legacy provoked reflection on responsibility. The atomic age had brought both hope and danger, and many scientists pointed back to Curie as a model of ethical clarity. She had never pursued power or wealth, never patented her discoveries, and never sought to use knowledge for harm. In an era of nuclear tension, her life was a reminder that discovery should remain a gift, not a weapon. By the close of the century, her name stood not only in textbooks and institutes, but also in the hearts of those who sought inspiration. She had become timeless, her light continuing to shine quietly, showing the way for those who searched the invisible world with patience and courage. As the 21st century began, Marie Curie's name remained firmly anchored among the most admired figures in human history. Her story had survived not only the passage of time, but the rapid transformations of science itself. Even as discoveries in genetics, computing, and space exploration reshaped the world, her life continued to be told as an example of perseverance, humility, and the quiet courage to confront the unknown. Universities around the globe honoured her through lectureships, scholarships, and research programs that bore her name. Young scientists studied her life not only for the knowledge she had given, but for the way she had pursued it, with dedication unshaken by hardship. In classrooms, her story was taught as part of the broader struggle for equality, reminding students that the barriers she overcame were as significant as the discoveries she made. To women entering scientific careers, she remained a touchstone, proof that brilliance recognized no gender. The Curie Institutes in Paris and Warsaw continued to thrive, each serving as a living monument to her vision. In Paris, advanced treatments for cancer were paired with cutting-edge research into molecular biology and nuclear medicine. Patients often entered the hospital unaware of the history behind its name, but doctors and researchers never forgot. In Warsaw, the institute stood as a symbol of national pride, tying the country's modern scientific achievements to the legacy of its most famous daughter. Her influence spread far beyond the laboratory. Writers and historians revisited her life repeatedly, each generation discovering new meaning in her story. Some emphasized her groundbreaking science, others her resilience in the face of prejudice and personal loss. Museums curated exhibitions that displayed her letters, instruments, and even the notebooks that, though still radioactive, were preserved as artifacts of discovery. Visitors came not only to learn about science, but to feel connected to the humanity behind it. Technology also brought her story to new audiences. Documentaries and online platforms shared her journey with millions, ensuring that her legacy reached beyond traditional classrooms. In these portrayals, she was often shown as both brilliant and modest, someone who had changed the world while living a life of simplicity. This dual image gave her an enduring power. She was extraordinary, yet deeply human. By the early 2000s, polls of the greatest scientists in history consistently placed her among the top ranks, often alongside figures like Einstein and Newton. But unlike many of her peers, her fame was not only in science but in culture. Her life symbolized the values of persistence, honesty, and service. In a world searching for examples of integrity, Marie Curie's story continued to shine, reminding humanity that discovery at its best is not about power or fame, but about illuminating what lies hidden and offering it to all. In the decades after the turn of the century, Marie Curie's presence remained vivid in both science and culture. Her legacy grew not only because of her discoveries, but because of the values she represented: integrity, humility, and devotion to truth. Universities held annual lectures in her honour, and students still studied the photographs of her laboratory, marvelling that such modest conditions had produced work that changed the course of history. Her story reminded them that brilliance was not about perfect equipment or grand institutions, but about patience and determination. The Curie Institute in Paris became one of the leading centres for cancer research in Europe. Doctors there developed advanced therapies using radiation, chemotherapy, and molecular medicine, all linked in spirit to Marie's early vision of science in service to humanity. Patients came from around the world, and for many the Institute's name itself carried hope. In Warsaw, the Radium Institute stood as a bridge between past and present, a reminder that science could endure even through political turmoil. Scientists working there often spoke of Marie not only as a national figure but as a personal inspiration. Her example gave them strength when resources were scarce, showing that persistence could overcome obstacles greater than material shortages. Outside laboratories, her influence reached into the arts. Biographies were reissued, films and plays reimagined her life, and museum exhibitions drew crowds eager to learn about the woman who had dared to study what could not be seen. Visitors often paused before her preserved notebooks, astonished to learn they were still radioactive after more than a century. The notebooks, resting in lead-lined boxes, became symbols of both her courage and the risks she had unknowingly endured. They spoke silently of the cost of discovery and of the depth of her devotion. For young women entering science, her story remained a powerful light. She was often described not only as the first woman to win a Nobel Prize, but as the first person to win two in different fields. That fact alone gave courage to students facing doubt, reminding them that no barrier was absolute. Her life was proof that talent and perseverance could carve paths through walls of prejudice. By the 2010s, she was consistently listed among the most influential people in history, her name appearing not only in scientific rankings but in cultural ones. Unlike many who fade into textbooks, Marie Curie remained alive in imagination, her journey told as both history and inspiration. She had become more than a scientist. She was a symbol of what humanity could be when guided by truth, service, and quiet strength. By the 21st century's second decade, Marie Curie's life had become a story retold in countless forms, yet it never lost its power. Her discoveries of polonium and radium were long absorbed into the foundations of science, but the image of her, a determined woman in a plain dress, bent over fragile instruments in a cold shed, remained unforgettable. It was this image, more than statistics or awards, that captured imaginations. People saw not only a scientist but a human being who had struggled, sacrificed, and persevered to bring light out of darkness. Museums dedicated exhibitions to her legacy. Visitors could see the tools she once used, the notebook still sealed for safety, and the photographs of her at work. Standing before these artifacts, many felt a quiet awe, recognizing that history's greatest discoveries often came from the simplest of circumstances. Her story was increasingly used in education not only to teach science, but to inspire resilience. Teachers told students that Curie had studied in secret as a young girl when women were denied access to universities, that she had supported herself through years of poverty in Paris, and that she had never let loss or prejudice turn her away from her path. These lessons carried as much weight as the principles of radioactivity themselves. In medicine, her influence endured each day. Hospitals across the world used radiation therapy as a standard treatment for cancer, techniques that traced directly back to her pioneering work. Patients, often unaware of the history behind their care, still benefited from the vision she had insisted on, that science must serve humanity. Her legacy was also felt in the growing number of women scientists who openly named her as their inspiration. In conferences and interviews, they spoke of how her story gave them courage to persist in fields where barriers still existed. Marie Curie had become more than a figure of the past. She was a companion for the present, her example guiding those who sought to follow her path. In Poland and France alike, she was honoured as both national hero and universal figure. Statues, schools, and institutes carried her name, but her true monument lay in the millions of lives touched by her discoveries and her example. She had shown that knowledge pursued with honesty and humility could illuminate not only the invisible world of atoms, but the human spirit itself. In recent decades, Marie Curie's influence has continued to expand far beyond the walls of laboratories. Her name is now found in space, where a crater on the Moon and one on Mars carry her legacy into the cosmos. These distant marks remind humanity that her work, which began in the quiet streets of Warsaw and the modest rooms of Paris, has reached the stars. She never dreamed of such honours, yet they symbolize how deeply her discoveries change the way we see the universe. Universities and scientific institutions around the globe have established awards and scholarships in her honour, ensuring that future generations of researchers follow her path. These prizes are often aimed at young women in science, carrying forward the spirit of equality she embodied. Each recipient joins a chain of perseverance that traces back to the moment when Marie first measured the faint rays of uranium in her laboratory. In culture, her life has inspired endless portrayals, novels, plays, films, and documentaries. Some focus on the drama of her discoveries, others on her personal sacrifices, but all return to the same central truth, that she embodied both brilliance and humanity. Audiences around the world connect with her humility, her simplicity, and her refusal to let hardship or fame change her. Her story, retold in each generation, continues to inspire because it speaks to universal struggles, poverty, loss, doubt, and to the strength needed to overcome them. Meanwhile, in hospitals worldwide, her influence is felt each day. Radiation therapy, though now advanced far beyond the early radium treatments, still stands as a direct continuation of her vision. Patients and doctors alike benefit from the tools she first revealed, often without realizing whose hands first uncovered them. This quiet, lasting presence in medicine may be her greatest gift. In Poland, France, and across the globe, her name is honoured not only as history but as living influence. Children learn her story in school books, scientists cite her in lectures, patients walk through hospital doors carrying her legacy within their treatment. The arc of her life, from hardship to discovery, from obscurity to timeless recognition, remains a story of light, one that continues to shine, reminding humanity of what can be achieved when knowledge is pursued with humility and courage. More than a century after her greatest discoveries, Marie Curie's light continues to shine. Her name stands not only among the greatest scientists in history, but also among the most admired human beings of any age. She began life in hardship, denied opportunities and shaped by grief, yet she rose to reveal truths hidden within the atom itself. The story of her life is one of perseverance, humility, and devotion, qualities as important as her discoveries. In modern classrooms, she is introduced not only as the discoverer of polonium and radium, but as the first woman to win a Nobel Prize, and the only person to win in two different sciences. Teachers describe how she studied secretly as a girl in Warsaw, how she endured poverty as a student in Paris, and how she laboured in a cold, draughty shed until the glow of radium proved she was right. To students, her life is more than history. It is a lesson in what can be achieved with patience and courage. In hospitals across the world, her influence is felt each day. Radiation therapy has saved millions of lives, evolving into advanced treatments she could scarcely have imagined. Each patient who benefits from these therapies, knowingly or not, walks in the light she first revealed. For doctors and scientists, her work remains a foundation, a reminder that discovery can serve humanity in profound ways. Her legacy also continues in the inspiration she gives to women in science. In every continent, young researchers look to her as proof that barriers can be broken, that brilliance recognizes no gender or nationality. Programs, awards, and institutes bearing her name support women who follow her path, keeping her vision alive. Beyond science and medicine, she's become part of culture itself. Her story has been told in countless books, films, and plays, each generation rediscovering her humanity as well as her genius. To the public, she's remembered not as a distant figure of history, but as a woman who walked in simplicity, who cooked for her daughters, who cycled through the countryside on her honeymoon, and who never sought wealth or power. Her life reminds us that greatness can exist alongside humility. Today, her resting place in the Pantheon in Paris symbolizes her place among the immortals of history. Yet her true monument is not stone, but the countless lives changed by her discoveries, and the hope she still brings to those who face obstacles. Marie Curie lit the invisible world, and in doing so she lit the path for humanity itself. Her story endures because it belongs not only to the past, but to the future, wherever knowledge is sought with honesty, courage, and love for truth.